Today I want to talk about persistent threats. By now, I'm assuming that most of you have either heard about the recent persistent threat attacks, one being the SunBurst attack on SolarWinds, secondarily the Halfnium attack on Microsoft Exchange, or perhaps unfortunately your organization has been a part of those as a victim. As a result of all of those attacks, we've seen a tremendous amount of noise from the cybersecurity community talking about strategies for prevention, mitigation, etc. But the real question is anyone really doing anything to attempt to create a line of defense against these attacks? And at Blastwave, we would argue that for the most part, they're not. Yesterday, a colleague of mine, Paul Gracie, put out an article. It was a short, cheeky article entitled, "Is it just me or does the Emperor have no clothes?" If you want to read it, let me give you the link. Hold on, that's not the link. Here it is. So this is the QR link, so you can just snap a picture of this with your phone, and you should be able to connect to it. But as I said, it's a short article. It was a little bit cheeky, and effectively what it did is it kind of called out the establishment cybersecurity vendors on the fact that they're selling you security products that aren't actually securing your network. And it called out some burning problems that we have in the cybersecurity space today, and specifically around the questions of, are we creating this first line of defense? And specifically beyond that, in the event that someone may be able to penetrate your network and get on the inside, do we have anything to mitigate the impact of those? And so I want to walk through this, and I'm going to use a combination of a PowerPoint and some information off the web to go through the discussion. So let's begin by taking a look at how our networks are protected today. And this is going to be familiar probably to everyone. So it's usually a combination of three technologies. In the wide area network, you're leveraging some type of SSL VPN technology, so a virtual private network. At the remote client, you're using hopefully some type of multi-factor authentication that is hopefully passwordless. To be able to protect your client's identity. And then within your local area network where your protected systems and applications lie, you attempt to protect those through access control and segmentation. And so if we look at that, we begin to ask the question, well, are these technologies that are designed to protect our critical systems today, are they actually doing what they're supposed to do and protect them? Well, let's take a look at the statistics. So let's go and let's start with an interesting stat. So this year, we, as a global economy, spent $25 billion in VPN. Looks like it's going to be almost 76 by 2027. So we know we are continuing to invest in this technology. If we look at the leading vendors in this space, and we're not going to mention any names, but you can see them, number one, number two, number three, and this may change, but in general, over time, they're all kind of the same list of vendors. If we were to look at them and ask ourselves, well, how secure are these particular vendor solutions? Well, we could look at number one. So we could go over to NIST and do a quick search on this particular vendor, and we can see that right now there are roughly 20 known vulnerabilities that range from pretty severe to maybe reasonably severe. And that's 20 doors of entry for a malicious actor. If we were to take that same approach and look at number two, then if we look at their statistics, they're doing a little bit better, less, but looks like at least one, if not, well, more of their vulnerabilities are highly critical. So there are multiple paths of entry for a would-be actor as well. Then finally, if we look at number three, which is a very well-known name, and we look at theirs, 70 known vulnerabilities from companies who are the leaders in providing virtual private networking technology. Now, why do we care about this? Well, we care because these vendors, these solutions that are supposed to be our first line of defense against these persistent threats are the very technologies that are being bypassed in many of these attacks. And so if we think about that, it makes sense, right? And let's walk through this. So if we're deploying VPN within our wide area network, then for the most part, we're using technology that's 20 years old that, as we've seen a moment ago, has hundreds of known vulnerabilities. And each time a vulnerability is reported, those vendors have to go and create a patch. That patch has to then be rolled out into their customer community, and then be propagated across the customer's network. So in many cases, it could be weeks or months before the door is closed effectively for malicious actors. Now, if we move over to the left and look at the remote user, I think we're beginning to do a good job by applying multi-factor authentication. Hopefully, most of those that are being leveraged now are passwordless, so that's good. But many of them are single surface based, which means that you can steal something. You can steal a single thing, and once you've stolen that single thing, a key fob, etc., then now they can take that and pretend to be you anywhere else in the world. So they're usually highly vulnerable to theft, but more importantly, they're not policy aware. And what we mean by that is that the devices that sit down here that perform the authentication process are largely unaware of what policies for access you might be granted or not granted. And so by that fact, it puts them in a position where this network is kind of a set of disparate parts. They're not all one acting in unison. Now, when we get to your LAN, most companies apply good old-fashioned segmentation, right? So through access control lists, et cetera, they're segmenting the network. It's a very time-consuming process for network engineers. Usually it is, well, not usually, it is in fact very prone to human error. More than 90% of all vulnerabilities and outages within networks today come from human error. Somebody made a configuration change that caused either an outage or a gap and created an opportunity. And so while it's a great attempt, these are really complicated, prone to human error, and so as a result, they're really vulnerable to insider threats. And if we take a look at these attacks, we can see that that's the case. So we need to ask ourselves, why do we care about this? And in asking that, we want to look at the behavior for how these persistent threats break into your network. And there's no magic to it. While they all may look unique in their approach, they all use a very common pattern. And the first portion of the pattern is reconnaissance. So effectively what they want to do is they want to identify a system somewhere inside of your network that they can somehow connect to and then or get to, and then use that to match up a known vulnerability. Now that may be a publicly known vulnerability, as the list that we just went through a moment ago, or it might be a personal or a private vulnerability that they have discovered. But in either case, their goal is to find a system on the inside of your network, which leads to the next step, which is to create a piece of malicious code that they can then drop down into that system that's sitting inside your network. Once the code's there, then now what do they want to do? Now they want to poke around. So they want to use the inherent vulnerabilities of your segmented LAN to scan around and find other systems that they can get to. And then once they've done that, they'll try to propagate or replicate that particular piece of code to another system. And then finally, what they want to do is call back home, right? So connect back home for the purpose of creating a command and control channel for that malicious actor. And if we take a look at that, then there's really no magic, right? They're coming into your network via one of a couple of methods. They're either coming through your secure network or they're walking in the front door. And in most cases, it's through your secure network that they're using to get there. In the case of SolarWinds, if we look at that real quickly, SolarWinds was a perfect example of that. So let me clean this slide up. Effectively what they did is the malicious entity had a malicious payload. They had identified through surveillance and reconnaissance a system that was vulnerable inside the SolarWinds build server, so they dropped it down there, and they simply let it use its own secure communication channels to be able to propagate that update across to their SolarWinds Orion instances that are sitting inside of the customer. From there, that instance replicated itself up to other systems and then created a command and control channel back home. Using the security technologies that we spent 20 some odd billion dollars on this year, or not using them, effectively bypassing them. In the case of the Halfnium attack, it was a very similar scenario. So in this case, they were able to identify a vulnerability that allowed them effectively to bypass the Exchange authentication process, so they were able to connect into Exchange, and then from there deliver a piece of malicious payload onto that allowed them to execute a script from there in Outlook Web Access and basically drag a bunch of Exchange emails back into wherever their servers are. And who knows what, I don't even think we know what yet how much impact that's going to have. So those technologies that were used to protect the network, to create that first line of defense, were exploited in both of these attacks. And I think many in the community would argue that as it pertains to advanced persistent threats, This is just the beginning. So we've got to create that line of defense. And let's talk about that. I want to introduce you to Blastwave. Blast Shield is our product. Blast Shield is a software-defined private network overlay that can be deployed over any packet-based network. When it's deployed, it renders your protected systems, applications, mechanical systems in industrial settings. It could be sensors, etc. It renders those systems invisible. So the network itself, the Blast Shield network, and all protected systems are effectively invisible. You can't scan it, you can't see it, you can't talk to it. Remote user access into a Blast Shield network is performed via a very convenient but highly secure three-surface multi-factor authentication process. And the reason that we use that model is it makes it immune to your common phishing exploits, but also reduces the risk of theft because of the requirement of multiple surfaces. And then more importantly, within that multi-factor authentication process, your users' access and visibility are bound to each other by policy. This inhibits the ability for let's say an actor pretending to be one of your remote users that connected into your network to now poke around because they can't see other systems unless they're granted specific access to those. Blast Shield is built on a proprietary transport methodology that is immune to SSL VPN exploits. So all of those 100+ exploits we just saw today, it is immune to those. And effectively it delivers this encrypted edge-to-edge network that runs across the entirety from your edge user into your application. And it's all manageable from a single policy orchestrator. And so how does this relate to the attack vectors that we looked at before? Well, if you start with reconnaissance, since this network and the assets that are protected behind it are invisible, then it makes it really difficult for reconnaissance to be performed because you can't identify those assets. And if you can't identify them, then it removes the ability for you to begin to identify what exploits might be associated with those assets. Which really leads to the second step, which is in terms of weaponization and delivery. If you can't find systems protected by that particular network, then it makes it really difficult for you to deliver those systems into a protected system. And so in terms of delivery, it really inhibits the malicious actor's ability to get their payload down inside your network. Now, we all recognize we don't live in a perfect world, and so if in fact a malicious payload is dropped into your network, this is where Blast Shield's ability to provide granular visibility bound to access control together and inhibits the ability for a piece of code to move laterally. And so you can envision a scenario where in the event that maybe somebody walked through the door and dropped a piece of code onto a server, well, if that server is protected behind a Blast Shield network, even if that code were dropped in via USB stick or something like that, then it makes it really difficult for that malicious code to propagate because it can't scan, because its scanning ability and its ability to connect to other systems is controlled by policy. So it can't see or connect. So it really inhibits that. And then finally, since Blast Shield effectively creates this air gap around these assets, it's effectively air gapping the malware as well. So that prevents the ability for it to beacon back to its home base and prevents the ability for command and control channels to be built. So thank you for your time. I wanted to walk through this. As you can see, we are very serious about the subject of creating a first line of defense against these persistent threats. We would enjoy a conversation if you're interested in learning more. I'm going to put two links up real quickly. First, this again is the link to Paul's article that he wrote. Along with that, if you want to speak to Paul live, this is a QR link to his LinkedIn profile. Additionally, you can reach us at www.blastwave.io, and we would love to have a communication with you. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and happy Friday, everyone.